This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Te Motu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations, a show about problematic faves, great trash, difficult art, and our complex relationship with art and entertainment. My name's Hugh, I'm the host, and I'd like to put in a very mild content warning for this show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good. But sometimes there are aspects to the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Read the episode descriptions for more information and do be aware of your listening environment. Alright, we are back on another episode of Reserved Recommendations, a show about great trash, problematic faves, and difficult art and culture, and I have my first ever returning guest, which is a little bit of a cheat because it's my brother again. Good evening, morning, it's both of those at once because we're transcontinental and crossing the time zones.
I think at this point, in discussions with people online who are in Facebook Place, we just tend to say good time zone to you and leave it at that.
Yes. A merry time zone to you, sir. The thing that we're going to talk to today, now I'm just going to apologise in advance both to you and listeners. There is a puppy who has decided to pick a fight with my wife, and as a result, he is being disciplined by being removed from the room where other people are hanging out so that he doesn't get to hang out until he behaves himself and stops nipping people's toes. So if you hear high-pitched barking noises in the background, that's just a thing that we're going to have to deal with for this episode, and with any luck, it's not too disruptive. So the thing that we're going to talk about today, which you mentioned you had a physical copy of propping up your monitor, oh, look at that hardcover as well. Crikey dick. Is the graphic novel by Alan Moore and his Mrs. Melinda Gebbie, Lost Girls. So there are a whole bunch of things to talk about with Lost Girls. I guess the place I'd like to start is why was that a thing that you wanted to talk about?
So it has been sitting under my monitor for a while, keeping it up, and I was actually listening to your podcast and kind of musing about what other things I could talk about, and it was right in front of me. And I think Lost Girls is quite good for talking about two very particular recommendations, which come with a bit of a caveat on them. The first one being Alan Moore in general. Mm-hmm. And the second being Lost Girls as a piece of pornography, which is also very much art, and various discussions around pornography as art and art as pornography, and those sort of discussions.
Yeah, well, let's kick it off with Alan Moore, and actually I think that Alan Moore isn't the be all and end all with this one, because uncharacteristically for me, I had already read Lost Girls, and I was able to reread it in its entirety, albeit as a tiny CBR file on my phone, so not really in its full glory. But in doing some research about it, it turns out that Melinda Gebbie's particular artistic trajectory and obsessions play quite a large role in the specific thing that Lost Girls is. But let's start with Alan Moore, because that's a fun place to start. A previous guest on this show, Anton Angelo, who was talking about The Residents, said of Alan Moore that he sounds like a fascinating bloke to have a beer with, but he'd probably get on your tits quite quickly.
Yeah, but I mean, like, also he's really interesting and really important in many ways. He is not got like so he is kind of the basis of a lot of the things that, if you are into comics and especially into sort of the more Sandman, Neil Gaiman that style of comic books.
It's specifically a wave of British comics that happened in the late 80s and early 90s. That's when Sandman starts, I think. That's when Alan Moore gets his initial Swamp Thing run from memory, which is one of the first very Alan Moore things that he did.
I mean, so Swamp Thing is in fact the first thing he does for a major comics label. And I think it's also really important to just for the discussion of Lost Girls and how that happens later on to kind of talk about the way that a lot of Alan Moore's early work works, which is he had made a name for himself in British comics, which are 2000 AD and Warrior. And the way that British comics work over American comics, for those people playing along at home who don't know, is they tend to be much shorter. So you'll have a self-contained story in a comic book which has a number of other comic stories in it. So it's less. This is continuate from when we last list Batman. This was happening to here's a self-contained story about Jeff from accounting or whatever.
It's a wee bit more like the way that that weekly or monthly manga publishing works, in that you'll have, rather than buying a Batman comic, you'll buy 2000 AD, which will have Judge Dredd and Strontium Dog and whatever it was that Alan Moore was doing at the time, but it'll have like the next chapter of a bunch of stories, all of which will be to some degree a self-contained arc.
Yeah, and so he gets noticed by DC Comics, which is one of the big two in America, to write for what is effectively a campy and pretty much dead property called Swamp Thing, who I think up to that point had been a radioactive monster from a swamp which fought crime for no particular reason. And him and his artists and his crew reimagine Swamp Thing as a sort of primeval swamp deity. If my memory serves me well, it's been a while since I've read it.
What they did was the first really big twist they dropped was the original conceit was that Swamp Thing was a scientist who'd been transformed into a swamp monster when I think it was like a combination of experimental chemicals and a lightning strike, or someone bombed his lab. There was some nonsense, comic nonsense. But the point was that he was supposed to have been a human who was mutated into this creature and gained plant powers. And what Alan Moore did by way of a twist was to rewrite that story and say that actually all along he was a plant god who had kind of absorbed the dying essence of this human scientist, but that he had in fact never been human and was something much more powerful and strange than human.
Yeah, and so that exact thing, right? So he took this, what was effectively a campy and kind of nonsense property, and switches it up into this very weird, very in-depth sort of written thing.
Quite psychedelic too.
Yeah, psychedelic thing. I think the other thing which is worth mentioning, because it's kind of historical interest, because it's where one of the places where Neil Gaiman gets his first shot at comics is Marvel Man. Yeah,
it's complicated. It becomes Miracle Man, but basically it's a knockoff English comic superhero based on Mr. Marvel or Marvel Man, who was a Marvel Comics superhero who they sort of retired for not being very interesting. And the American one goes through a lot of permutations, and I think in his most recent permutation is a space alien of some sort. I don't know, but anyway, this opportunistic British publisher in the 40s basically did a same as that version, and Alan Moore picked that up as well and retooled it.
Yeah, so he retools that again as this it is the same setup as Shazam or whatever. The fact is that there is a kid who can say a magical word and change into a superhero. But Alan Moore reimagined that as this guy, this child has grown up and still kind of knows that there is something special about him. If only he could remember that word. And it's a very tortured and very odd and very challenging comic in many ways. And again, but it's again this taking these old properties, doing something very, trying to tell quite deep and touching stories with them, and reimagining them, or asking the question, well, what about, what if? And that's, I mean, also notable because once he finishes with that, he passes it on to Neil Gaiman, which I think is one of Neil Gaiman's first comics.
Yes, I've read Neil Gaiman's Miracle Man stuff, and it's interesting. It's him. It's a sort of bunch of short stories set in the world after the Miracle Man comic, and so it's a sort of it's like a little sampler of all of these different things going on, rather than a big contained story. I think the other thing that is going to stand us in good stead for this discussion is it's worth mentioning that in Swamp Thing, Alan Moore continued the series trope of Swamp Thing having a girlfriend, and he takes that to its logical conclusion by having her tried for bestiality, because Swamp Thing is not a human and they are having sex through weird plant magic. And in Miracle Man, along with some really astounding violence, which, I mean, we can't really go into without explaining the entire plot, which would take too long. But just take it from me, if you go and seek out Miracle Man, be prepared for some really grim shit to happen on a massive scale. Yeah. As well as that, he courted controversy by getting his artist to depict an anatomically accurate birth on in like graphically in a comic panel, and I think this is another thread of Alan Moore's career.
Yeah, so I think it's time to get to there is the two sides. Perhaps even the same thing about Alan Moore makes him both really worth looking out for, but also why it's a reserved recommendation, which is. For instance, From Hell, his book about his sizable graphic novel about Jack the Ripper, is really, really well researched. And this is the thing about Alan Moore is he goes very, very deep on whatever he is writing, and that can sometimes make his work very dense and very hard to get into. And also, he will not shy away very much from where that takes him, which, as you say, can be kind of horrifyingly graphic or in a number of ways.
It's also worth mentioning that Alan Moore is a practicing magician in the religious sense of that word. And quite self-consciously rides the line between magic as genuine religious practice and magic as hucksterism. And so that kind of element will often find its way into his work. The idea that there is a hidden truth, or that that sometimes the real battle is a battle for human perception, which shapes the world because perception is magic. And so fundamentally you're either on board with that one or you're not. It's one of those things where Alan Moore will either periodically turn your mind inside out, or he will be the most pretentious person you've ever read.
Yes, entirely. I guess it's also worth, because we're having the chat about Alan Moore, it's worth touching on the hits, because again, to explain why Alan Moore is one of those people you should go out and read, we should really talk about, at least very quickly, Watchmen, and more importantly, I think V for Vendetta.
Alan Moore's second career is that guy whose works get adapted into movies that he hates with a fiery passion.
Yeah, no, entirely. And he has talked at length about why he doesn't like films of his comics, which is fair enough. The idea being that they're comics, and they work as comics, and they were built as comics, and to say then to try and make a film out of them is, I think, in his eyes, a bit like trying to make a novel from the Mona Lisa, or whatever.
Yeah, I think there's that element. I watched a couple of interviews, not all the way through because Alan Moore can get tiresome when you listen to him talk for an extended period, but one of the things that he said, and it's an interesting thing that, I mean, this is a separate conversation, but to have with possibly someone else in a different place, but I was struck by something that someone was saying in a discussion about Neon Genesis Evangelion, which is that anime and manga are very much pulp media. And what that means is that while people do make high art in those forms, the scrutiny of a multi-million-dollar, like highly commercial or high art industry isn't really placed on them. And so you can get away with stuff. And sometimes that means unmitigated crap, or the worst kind of pandering. And sometimes that means that you can get away with making points that you couldn't necessarily make in other media. And so I think one of the things that gets lost in film adaptations of Alan Moore, even though they've been very successful and very influential, I think, is that he can often be quite ambivalent. So V for Vendetta is a really good example. In the movie, V is someone who fights for democracy, and fundamentally the way that the movie frames it, everything that he does is kind of justified because he creates this mass movement of the people to overthrow the tyrannical government. In the comic, V is an anarchist, but not only an anarchist, he's quite amoral. He turns the female hero into a kind of echo of himself through literally torturing her into a psychedelic crisis, and breaking down her personality so that she has no option other than to either die or transform herself into another V. And like, that's framed as effective, but not necessarily forgivable.
Yeah, I mean, again, I've been also listening to just some of his talks going past, and what he says about V for Vendetta is that it was a discussion about whether using violence for change is ever a good idea, and he thinks it comes down on the side of it's not, but people will do it anyway, and that's a really difficult point to get across in a film, in a Hollywood film these days, I think. And yeah, so I can see that lots of those finer points get lost along the way.
Yeah, so I guess what we're saying is that with Alan Moore, you have someone who works largely in I guess you'd call it like elevated pastiche. Like he's almost always working with other people's characters or characters that come from the kind of great pop cultural canon, particularly of British literature, and who is also prone to try and make quite nuanced and complicated points. And I think you could have arguments about whether he's always successful about that.
Yes, entirely. And I guess I'll just jump back to one of the things you were saying about being able to make points in kind of lowbrow media that you couldn't in highbrow media. And I think that's something definitely Alan Moore has said, is that, look, comics were, for a long time, for the working class. They were books with pictures because, you know, those lower sorts can't all read and they need pictures to go with the words. And so, as you say, there wasn't as much scrutiny of what was going on in them. So you could make these more radical points in comics because comics are for kids and comics are, you know, are silly little things that nobody really pays attention to. And I think that's definitely something Alan Moore rode for a large part of his career.
Yeah, I think so. And I think we might get to actually talking about the work in a bit, but I want to have a wee chat with you about Melinda Gebbie as well, because I don't know if you did as much homework on her as I did, but she's definitely in that comics give you a venue to say stuff that you can't otherwise say because no one important is watching camp. So she's someone who came up through underground comics, and where, according to one interview I saw with her, she reckoned that women so she was underground comics in the mid to late 70s, so sort of post the American underground comics boom, which sort of coincides with the general psychedelic counterculture boom. And she is an American, but she was associated with people who were part of that scene, like Bob Crumb and S. Clay Wilson and people like that. And one of the things that she talks about is getting into trouble with those sorts of people, not necessarily those people specifically, but those sorts of people, by taking the kind of hyper-violent and hyper-sexual stuff that they were doing and turning it round from a female perspective. And so one of the things that she said was that it was very funny to her how shocked all of these guys were who'd been, you know, drawing sexual fantasies about wouldn't it be lovely to have a woman without a head so she couldn't talk, when suddenly she was presenting them with these really sexual, really violent comics about like gangs of women kidnapping masculine stereotypes and holding them in a basement so that they could like use them for their sexual pleasure and then torture and eat them. And so her trajectory comes out of this sort of turning that in some ways quite misogynistic underground comic scene back on itself and presenting things that way.
Yeah, no, I mean, as you say, I haven't been as familiar with Melinda Gebbie's work, but I'm just kind of glancing across her Wikipedia entry. And it comes up and talks with her and Alan Moore about I've forgotten what it's called. The thing that she's most famous for is called Fresca Zizis.
Fresca Zizis, yes. Which is still, I believe, banned in the UK.
Yeah, so which is a comic book which gets banned in the UK, but she is taken to court for that on the basis of obscenity and has to defend that claim, and does so on the basis of these are my experiences of living a life with sexual abuse and various other unpleasant things in it. So if you want to take somebody to court for obscenity, you should be taking the people who did this to me, not me, which is an interesting tack. But Sorry.
And I think the thing to take from this really is that it might be tempting to see a husband and wife team where the husband is this very prestigious comics writer who is not much of an artist, and the wife is this artist who's quite well regarded in specific circles but doesn't really have the same kind of widespread recognition because she is very much a kind of underground comics figure. It might be tempting to see that if the result of that collaboration is pornography, which Lost Girls certainly 100% is, whatever else it is, it might be tempting to see that as a product of the husband kind of pushing his own sexual obsessions on the wife. And I think if you look at Melinda Gebbe's work, you will find that is 100% not the case. Almost all of her work in comics has been very sexual to the point of pornographic and been about turning that sexuality around and presenting it from a female perspective, and sometimes deliberately using that to goad and frighten men.
Yeah.
Also, fun Melinda Gebbe fact that I found out researching this. She was one of the people who worked on the film adaptation of Raymond Briggs's When the Wind Blows.
I see.
Yeah,
Excellent.
I mean, she did something, I can't remember what her job title was, but it's some very minor role about like animating mobile background elements. So like she was responsible for doing clouds or like buildings that changed or something like that. It was not a major job, but nonetheless, there you go. If you watch that movie, then you are looking at the work of Melinda Gebbe.
So, shall we start to talk about Lost Girls in particular?
So what we might do is, because we are nearly at the halfway point, we might actually take a break now and come back after these important messages, and then we can talk about Lost Girls in specific.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
And we're back on Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast on Manawatu People's Radio. Today, Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu, and I am talking to my first returned guest, my brother Angus, live, well, not live, but direct from quite sunny-looking Glasgow in the Zoom window there. And we were talking about Lost Girls by Alan Moore and his wife Melinda Gebbe, and we've just spent the first half talking pretty much just about Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbe. But that's probably useful background to then go on and talk about Lost Girls. So do you want to maybe explain for people who haven't run across it in kind of basic terms what Lost Girls is?
So let's cut across the plot as much as it exists. The plot is that in a hotel in pre-World War II...
pre-World War I even, I believe.
Pre-World War I.
Because the plot, so far as it exists, involves the beginnings of World War I happening in the background while everything else goes on.
I couldn't remember which World War it was. That's right. But yes, in a hotel pre-World War I, what is revealed to be Wendy from Peter Pan, Alice from Through the Looking Glass, and Dorothy meet together through happenstance and various other things and explore and discuss their sexual awakenings and sexual fantasies, and while having sex with each other and various other characters throughout.
And in the reason that it was worth kind of talking about Alan Moore's specific patterns for the first half of this episode is that the way that those sexual awakenings turn out all mirror the structure or the story of the kind of more famous stories that those characters are from. And so Alice's story has parallels to In Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Dorothy's story begins with her getting caught in a literal, actual, real tornado and masturbating while being spun around in a house that's been lifted off the ground. And Wendy's story involves her and her brothers being kind of sexually initiated by Peter Pan, who in this version is sort of implied to be homeless or the leader of a gang of working class kids or something like that. But
Yeah.
the extent to which anything is genuinely supernatural is quite heavily fudged.
Yeah. And yeah, so that's, I think, one point to start on is, again, we have this part where we have these characters that you perhaps know and love taken off into these very sexual, very odd places. And as you say, that got them in some amount of trouble as Peter Pan's J.M. Barrie?
Yes.
Estate sued.
I wasn't aware of that. I'm not surprised by it, but I hadn't picked that up. Yeah, I mean, there's that, and also the book, Melinda Gebbie's exploration of sexuality, and this was the reason that I kind of wanted to talk about her career, is very, it's not just graphic and explicit, it's very encyclopedic. She does pornography as a kind of investigation of sex and sexual taboo, and so she will do, not just sex and then gay sex, but sex and then gay sex and then bondage and then incest and then non-consensual or consent blurred sex and sex involving minors of various kinds, and that's all in Lost Girls. So if any of those things are going to be really problematic for you to read about, then maybe skip Lost Girls.
Maybe skip Lost Girls. And yeah, I think that's, so again, hearing an interview with Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie, one of the things that Alan, though, they were talking about was that to try and keep it away from the sort of torture porn styles of a lot of modern pornography, where all the women look like they're not having fun. The process for writing this book was a lot about Alan going to Melinda and saying, well, what about this? And her either saying, well, yeah, that's cool, let's do that, or how about we change this, or how about you ramp it up like this? And so I think it's also very interesting as a piece of pornography written by that process of passing the scenes backwards and forwards, to see what works for both people. Yeah, no, that's very interesting, because it's an idea of sort of artistic pornography by consent, which is a fundamental thing when you're dealing with real sex. The other thing that I find very interesting about it is that it takes place in a sort of, and it discusses, because it's the other thing is that towards the end of the book, the characters start discussing the concept of sexual fantasy and pornography. And so the book itself it's not just being pornography, it's trying to talk about pornography and how pornography works. And one of the concepts that it explores towards the end of the book is this idea of almost, I don't know, it's not a term I've ever heard anywhere before, but I guess you could coin a term and call it like porn space. So the idea that porn isn't supposed to represent actual sex, because actual sex involves a bunch of
physical bodies which have weight, and thus have to be negotiated in particular ways around like what's practical, but also actual human consent can be slow and complicated in a bunch of ways. And so porn space is this kind of alternate reality where like everything is okay because we've declared that this is porn space. And so even stuff that would be abhorrent if it were real can be presented for the purpose of fantasy, because we've all agreed together, including because this is Alan Moore and he's being meta, the characters taking part in the scenario have agreed that this is a fantasy, so we're allowed to do these things.
Yeah, and I think so this is a good point to jump on, is that while we are saying this is pornography, and if you listen to Alan Moore and Melinda Gibby, they also say this is pornography. It's more than that, because as you say, in many ways, it is a discussion of pornography. It is a homage to erotica and pornography throughout the ages.
Oh yeah, because Melinda Gibby does like what's the guy's name? Beardsley. He was a sort of Art Nouveau artist, died very young, but also did a bunch of erotica. He's did a very famous portrait of Salome, I think, the biblical character who demanded St. John the Baptist's head. And also Franz Bayros, who is another European, I think 18th or 19th century erotic illustrator. And she does kind of homage pastiches of both of their styles in passing.
Yeah, and I think that's the other thing to note about this book. It's absolutely stunningly beautiful. And the artistic style changes pretty constantly from chapter to chapter to chapter, and everyone is these beautiful references and pastiches of artists and styles, and the storytelling changes along with the art. This book took something like 17 or 18 years to come to fruition. So it is absolutely gorgeous. Like the each page is in of itself like a work of art.
It certainly is, and Melinda Gibby is an incredibly accomplished artist. If you look at any of her work, even when she's being rough and scratchy, she can't quite help herself but be meticulous. There's a sort of mini documentary about her art that you can find on YouTube, which is called something like The Mad, Bad, Sad Girl Art of Melinda Gibby, which is basically her narrating her own artistic career. So they show stills of her art and she talks about them. And I was struck by how often she said, this is me being mean. This is me trying to make someone ugly, and this is me being mean to this person that I didn't like or that I was angry at in the moment. And yet, she might have made someone grotesque, but it's always very, very kind of, I don't know, it's a very stylized and beautiful grotesque.
Yeah. And so that, one of the things which is very interesting is they talk about having beauty-proofed this, and perhaps even a little bit of a flat-footing people who are going to start yelling about this book by coming out and saying, this is pornography, while making it as pretty as possible. And it threw some people, because some people, they came out and said, this is pornography, and people came back when, no, this is art.
At which point Alan Moore said, no, this is pornography.
Yeah. Their thinking it seemed that if they'd come out and said this is art, a lot of people would go, no, that's pornography. and yeah, so I think it's also like in a broader sense a discussion of that point about whether this is art or whether this is pornography, and whether that's those two things are separated, whether there is some magical line that you step over to get into pornography from art, which is a large discussion. But I also remember us talking about a movie called Behind the Green Door. Is that my memory serving me well?
Oh, yes.
About the rise of porn in the 70s as the sort of art house thing to do.
Yeah, so I can't remember what the movie that we were talking about is called. So it was about the two brothers. I think they were twin brothers who kind of led the charge on cinematic pornography in the 1970s. So they were the people who made Deep Throat, and they made Behind the Green Door. Like I say, I cannot for the life of me remember their names. But yes, it's a fascinating, or the name of the movie. But it's a fascinating movie because they had a similar thing going on where, and in their case, it was partly to skirt the rules about what counted as pornography. It was about, if you had no story at all, then there could not possibly be any artistic merit in what you've done. But if you had a story, no matter how cursory or weird, then what you had was a sexually explicit film and not necessarily like meritless pornography according to the letter of the law. And so they did all kinds of weird stuff, like have God represented, like have Adam and Eve dealing with God, who was represented by a chimp who talked with the voice of John Wayne, because it was the 70s and cocaine is a hell of a drug. But yeah, there was very much that kind of you have to have artistic merit in order to skirt the rules about what's pornography and what's not. And then I think they're coming at it from opposite directions, because I suspect that Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie would have set out to make a beautiful thing anyway, and these guys made a thing which is occasionally beautiful because they were trying to get as close to the line of the rules as possible.
But I mean, also, you seem, if my memory serves me well, you were talking about how what happened on the back of that was it became for a very short period, very fashionable to go to an adult movie theater, and the porn chic of the 70s was for a while a dominant kind of fashion trend.
Yeah. No, there was a brief period where, off the success of, I believe, Deep Throat initially, and then Behind the Green Door, porn briefly became kind of de rigueur for anyone who was kind of on the edgy side of hip in the cool side of American celebrity culture to be out and watching.
Yeah, so I mean, I get that kind of just leads again into this discussion about, I think, Lost Girls and things like that about, well, what do we say? Do we say it's art? Do we say it's porn? And you know, the idea of this being exceptionally, exquisitely drawn pornography does kind of raise lots of those questions about, well, what do we think about that as a book, as an art form, as something that exists in the world?
Yeah, I mean, I guess if we're going to try and answer the question and solve all of the world's problems, I kind of feel like pornography is a genre, if you like, and that, like any other genre, you can have good and bad work in that genre, and that, like any other genre, the criteria for what you consider good and bad vary a bit. You know, like the things that make science fiction good or bad or reprehensible are different from the things that make realistic, grounded drama good or bad or reprehensible are different from the things that make thrillers good or bad or reprehensible. And I think pornography has its own set of rules for things that make it good or bad or reprehensible. And I guess I feel like, with all of our reservations taken into consideration about, there's some stuff that might make you just nope out straightforwardly because it's a trigger for you. But if you can handle it and meet it on its level, I think Lost Girls is a fascinating study in trying to be as responsible as possible while still being very transgressive.
Yeah, I think that's really what brings me to Lost Girls a lot of the time, because I think like you, I first met it when it was kind of passed to me on a memory stick with a bunch of other comics, as was the way we consumed comics in our youth. And because it was on there, I read it, and I was, you start off going, well, this is just porn, and then you get kind of pulled into it because there is, you quite quickly figure out there's a lot more going on there than just nude women with their legs open. And so I think it is more than that just the gratuitous sexual exploits of the characters. And I think it is in many ways because, of course it is, because it's Alan Moore and Melinda Gaby. It's a comment on itself, and it's a comment on sexuality, and it's a comment on art, and it's a comment on pornography, and it's well worth reading if you, as you say, if you can make it over a lot of the things that are happening in there, if those are things that you can read about and see on a page, then it's really worth looking up.
Yeah, and I think there are two more points about it that I would like to talk about in passing. One, I guess, is the idea of weaponizing female sexuality as a way to intimidate predatory men, because that's something that Melinda Gebbie talked about doing over and over and over again when I found her talking about her own work. And that's a literal plot point in the Wendy storyline, is that Captain Hook is a pedophile who is stalking all of these. So it's a difficult line because they're depicting sexual activity with basically children, but between themselves as being somehow sacred or pure, and the behavior of this adult character who is the Captain Hook in the story as being predatory, but the way that Wendy ends up defeating this pedophile is literally brandishing her genitals at him, which becomes the ticking crocodile, which destroys him. So I think that the fact that it's not just pornography, but it's pornography that's like clearly born out of its creators' specific drives and obsessions and recurring artistic motifs and thoughts is interesting.
Yeah, I think definitely the other thing that I'm now remembering I kind of wanted to hit on is the focus of this book is on the three female characters, right? And again, there are some male characters some of whom are even recurring, but the majority of the focus is on the sexual experiences of the three female characters in that. And again, I think that's that thing from Melinda Gaby of switching the standard operating procedures around, where we would usually be focusing on the phalluses as they are transported around any particular porn scene. And so while this is pornography, it is centered very strongly on three female characters and their sexual experiences and their it is seen through their view of the world.
Yeah, and with a particular focus on their desires, which is unique for, well, not unique but unusual for pornography. The other thing that I wanted to talk about, which I suppose is also channeling the creator's obsessions and thoughts, but maybe from Alan Moore's side more than Melinda Gebbie's side, is the undercurrent about the war happening in the background, because I think that there is a very clear thesis to this book, which is that violence is the result of sex either denied or gone wrong. And I think you could argue with Alan Moore about that if you wanted to, but certainly his point about the war and the conversations that the characters have about the looming threat of war and the way that the soldiers are presented once the characters have all left the hotel and the soldiers arrive because the front of World War I has finally reached there. The way that the soldiers behave is very clearly presented as a sort of sublimated sexual urge that's turned into kind of purposeless destruction, like they make these sexual noises while they're smashing up the hotel room that the women have been in the previous scene. So I think it's interesting to see the genre of pornography used to try and convey an extra point like that. That's not a thing that often happens with it.
Yeah, so I think it very much is a discussion of sexuality, and I think there is, as you say, this thesis about a lot of violence coming from either repressed or sexuality gone wrong or sexuality in various other ways. And I think there is also like a second point in there, probably from Alan Moore and Melinda Gebbie's sort of like a very subtle dig back at comics in general, I would say, about, putting this moment of violence. There's a moment of violence right at the end of the book, and I think in many ways, or at least in some very small way, there is a contrast in the thing about, hey, you remember how we've just had this entire sizable book of pornography. If you've found that shocking and you don't find this last moment of violence shocking, you should probably have a look at your life, because that's, again, one of the things that gets brought up in discussions, especially of things like Lost Girls and the comics in general, where shocking acts of violence are perfectly fine, while loving acts of sexuality are horrifying, and we couldn't let the children see that. But more disembodied, decapitated heads, that's fine. Let's do that. Which is, I think, another like subtle point that may have been worked in there a little bit.
Yeah, no, definitely. All right, well, we are very close to time, so I think what we might do is do the extra reading portion of the exercise. So if people have thought that this discussion of Lost Girls is interesting, is there stuff aside from Lost Girls itself that you would recommend that people read? Or discussions that you'd recommend people check out?
That's an interesting question. I knew we were going to ask this question. I still don't have a very good answer. I would definitely suggest that you go and read more Alan Moore. Mm-hmm. If you can get your way through Lost Girls, or you find Lost Girls sort of things interesting. And again, check out the work of Melinda Gebbie, wherever you can find it. As for the particular thing Lost Girls is, I'm not sure if there are great kind of what to do next sort of places.
Yeah,
So
I have three suggestions, and I'd be interested to hear how useful that you think that they are. The first one, which is probably the least useful, is that there is a collection of Japanese visual novels, including pornographic ones, that you can play for free at a website called asenheim.org. Rather than spell that out, I will, I guess, put a link in a Facebook post or in a description or something. Anyway, the reason that I mention that is because they're a really interesting intersection of pornography and video games and art, just because the structure of the visual novel means that all of the work goes into writing and still panel artwork. So even though the sexuality in them can be fairly reprehensible and regressive, particularly when you're getting ones from the 80s and 90s, they can be strikingly pretty in a way that often pornography is not incentivized to be, which I find quite interesting. The other things that I were going to suggest was if you want to see pornography being used for something that's not pornography, then you should check out Oglaf, which is a webcomic using pornography for the purposes of comedy. Some of the comics are entirely safe for work, but it's worth checking out, I think, if you want to see what a modern example of thoroughgoing sex positivity being used for something other than just sexiness is. And my other thing to check out was actually another webcomic. There's a webcomic called Curvy, which I believe has now finished, or there's a new chapter coming, but God knows when. But it's a long-running lesbian erotica series, and the reason that I was recommending it is because I don't know if it's a thing that happened by accident or if it's a thing that was initially part of the plan, but it is a thing where there does develop this theme about, and in this case it's about how to responsibly manage relationships while being poly, effectively. But it's interesting again because it's using pornography to communicate this message about how you responsibly look after other people.
Yeah, so I guess I will jump on the webcomic bandwagon if you're just interested in how comics can be used to discuss and improve sexuality. There is Oh Joy Sex Toy, which is a couple in the US reviewing sex toys and doing so in comic form, which is well worth looking into if that is something that you are into.
Isn't that Alison Bechdel of the Bechdel test fame?
No, I don't think so.
Sorry, I don't know where I got that idea then.
I mean, it might be the artist from that. It is Erica Moen is her name.
Right, no.
And now the second thing that I was going to suggest has gone completely out of my head, but there is again, relatively there. I guess the general thing is, if you are interested in this sort of thing, do look into webcomics. That's where a lot of this work is being done these days.
Yeah, and it's not uncommon for people who have more mainstream, safe for work webcomics to also draw erotic ones as well, and I find that quite interesting. But also, I mean, you can see that they're kind of developing different sides of their style in two different directions.
And yeah, I cannot remember for the life of me what it is called, but there is a quite famous webcomic which is also out in trade paperback in comic book stores around the place about a lesbian bondage and domination and submission relationship, and it's called something like Sundance or something, I think, but it is gone from my head and it will not return.
Oh, well.
We're very well written, very well drawn. Again, dealing with sexuality in a way which is fetishizing it, but not done cheaply, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and we don't really have time to have this conversation in full, but it's worth mentioning that a lot of the stuff that's kind of become commonplace in discussions about responsible sexuality, so ideas about conversations about consent, ideas about how you respectfully manage multiple partners, ideas about how you, even in monogamous relationships, clear up communication and make sure that everyone is being looked after. A lot of those ideas and concepts have their roots in kink communities, because when you're doing stuff at the extreme edges, then your technology needs to be a lot more reliable. So I think the internet being the internet and fantasy being fantasy, that's kind of a natural home for art that's trying to explore this stuff responsibly and find ways to talk about it.
Yeah, no, entirely. So a lot of the discussions that we see around consent and the ways to handle that do come from kink educators, and a lot of the ways that people are now having discussions about desire and what people want out of relationships, again, comes from those sort of kink sorts of basis. So again, if you are interested in that sort of stuff, the internet is your playground, and there are plenty of resources about that. And on some level, I would suggest, if you haven't spent an afternoon combing through discussions about negotiation and discussions about consent, that you do that right now, because that will improve your life and your relationships no end.
Yeah, no, it's one of those things that you look at in these spaces that you don't necessarily belong to and go, gosh, that's useful. I wish that someone had taught me that, but I suppose that you guys have put yourself in a situation where you needed to learn it real quick. All right, we are out of time. Thank you very much for talking. As a parting shot, plug your shit again in case people have not heard the previous episode that you did.
Because I've just spent the past however long discussing pornography, I'm not really going to pitch the charity I work for.
Nope, fair enough.
Go if these sort of things worry you. There are, in the UK, and you happen to be in the UK, there is a UK charity called Backlash, which supports people who get kicked out of their job for having alternative sexual practices and that sort of thing, and kind of help out in defamation cases and things like that. So if you have some spare money and this sort of stuff worries you, go find them and throw them some cash. I cannot tell you off the top of my head if there is a New Zealand counterpart, but if you can find one of those, go throw them some money. Because people are still getting kicked out of their jobs and losing their jobs because what they do in their own consensual free time.
Yep, and if nothing else, go follow a gay furry on Twitter. All right,
yeah, basically.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show is produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. You can find me on the internet at Objective Realty on Twitter, and you can find the show on Facebook under Reserved Recommendations. If you've got a reserved reserved recommendation of your own, feel free to pitch it to me in either of those two places. And if you enjoyed the show, why not go ahead and recommend it to a friend? You can find past episodes at www.npr.nz/show/reserved on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit radio station. If you enjoy this or any of their other fine audio programming, why not fling them a couple of dollars? Go to npr.nz/donate for more information.